In Ironclad Correctional Facility, a black inmate was about to challenge the unchecked rule of a white prison guard who had ruled through fear for over 2 decades. What started as a reassignment to a dangerous cell block spiraled when Sergeant Frank Bull Hardwick decided that Malcolm Tate needed to learn his place. Malcolm Tate wasn't your typical prisoner. For years, he had been a community organizer in Atlanta, a voice against systemic oppression, known for rallying people, unshakable resolve, and refusing to back down in the face of power. He had faced corrupt police, biased courts, and now he found himself in the heart of the very machine he had fought against. When Bull Hardwick orchestrated a brutal initiation in the dead of night, he had no idea he was messing with a man who understood the long game, who knew that true power wasn't in brute force, but in unity, in exposing truth, in changing the rules of the game itself. Malcolm didn't fight back the way Bull expected, but his calm defiance set off a ripple effect no one could contain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What began as one man's abuse of power would become a reckoning that shook Ironclad to its foundation. The prison, its guards, and every inmate inside would never forget the day Bull Hardwick realized that his rule was no longer absolute, and that Malcolm Tate wasn't just another inmate. He was the beginning of the end. The bus rumbled to a stop before Ironclad Correctional Facility, a concrete monolith rising from the Georgia pines. Sergeant Frank Bull Hardwick watched from the guard tower, eyes narrowing at the new inmates through dusty windows. "Tate's on that bus," said Officer Bennett, "the agitator from Atlanta." Bull's jaw tightened. Malcolm Tate, community organizer turned convict after a protest turned violent. He'd seen his type before, educated black men who thought their words could change the natural order. "Put him in D block," Bull ordered. "Let's see how much fight he's got when he's sharing space with the Aryan Brotherhood." Captain Morales assigned him to B. "I don't give a damn what Morales says. D block, I'll take responsibility." In the processing room, Malcolm Tate stood at the intake desk. Unlike the other arrivals, hunched, hollow-eyed men, Malcolm stood straight, his gaze level, observing everything. "Prison ID 45873, droned the intake officer. "Tate, Malcolm Xavier, aggravated assault on a police officer inciting a riot. 15 years. Malcolm's eyes met Bull's. Bull expected fear, or at least deference. Instead, he found himself being evaluated coolly as if Malcolm were the one in uniform. "You got something to say, 45873? Bull asked, stepping closer. "No, sir," Malcolm replied, each word precise. "Just getting acquainted with my new home." Something in his tone, the careful neutrality that wasn't quite submission, made Bull's neck flush with heat. "D block," Bull announced loudly. "Reassignment." 2 hours later, Malcolm stood naked in his cell as Bull and 3 guards conducted an extra thorough search, a ritual of humiliation Bull had perfected over the years. "Spread 'em wider," ordered Officer Kendrick, eager to prove himself. Malcolm complied silently, his face a mask of dignified patience. When the search ended, Malcolm dressed with unhurried movements, no trembling hands, no downcast eyes. "You think you're tough," Bull said. "But Ironclad has a way of teaching lessons that stick, especially to men who don't know their place." Malcolm met his gaze. "I've studied history, Sergeant. The lessons aren't always learned by those you think need teaching." Bull chuckled, humorless. "We'll see about that, Professor." As Bull walked away, Lieutenant Daniel Wilkes fell into step beside him. "D block for Tate?" Wilkes asked quietly. "Captain won't be happy about the reassignment." "Morales doesn't run this prison," Bull replied. "Men like us do. I read his file, graduated top of his class. The assault charge seems convenient." Bull stopped walking. "You questioning the system now, Lieutenant?" Wilkes held Bull's gaze briefly before looking away. "No, sir. Just being thorough." "Good. Because men like Tate, they're more dangerous than gangbangers and killers. They make others believe things can change." Bull's voice dropped. Nothing changes here unless I say it does. That evening in the mess hall, Bull watched as the racial divisions revealed themselves. White inmates to the left, black inmates to the right. Malcolm took his tray to a table occupied by Jerome Red Carter and other older black inmates. "Nobody invited you," Red said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Malcolm set his tray down anyway. "I'm Malcolm." "I know who you are," Red replied. "The question is, do you know where you are?" "I'm exactly where they want me to be," Malcolm said calmly. "Question is why they're so afraid of where I was." Heads turned. Red studied Malcolm, then laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Sit down then. Your funeral." Bull observed as Malcolm ate, noting which inmates glanced his way with curiosity rather than hostility. "You see that?" Bull murmured to Wilkes. "Already trying to build his coalition. What exactly are you worried he'll do? One man against an entire system?" "It's not what he can do," Bull replied. "It's what he represents. Hope is a disease in a place like this. It spreads." He straightened his uniform. "We're going to cure it. Tonight." After lights out, Bull summoned 2 inmates, Wagner and Dupree, white supremacists who'd earned privileges by doing Bull's dirty work. "There's a new arrival in cell 18, Bull told them. "Needs to understand how things work here." Wagner grinned, revealing homemade prison dental work. "How rough you want it, Sarge?" "Nothing permanent, but make sure he understands his choices, fall in line or suffer." "What about the night guards?" "Simpson's on D block tonight. He'll take an extended bathroom break around 2 a.m. You'll have 15 minutes. Bull slid a makeshift shank across the desk. "Insurance, just in case your professor decides to fight back." As Bull left, he spotted Wilkes in the parking lot, sitting in his car, staring at nothing. Bull pulled alongside him. "Something on your mind, Lieutenant?" Wilkes startled slightly. "Just thinking, sir." "Dangerous pastime in our line of work," Bull said. "See you tomorrow." At home, Bull poured bourbon and sat on his porch, listening to cicadas in the darkness. 23 years at Ironclad had taught him that power wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about knowing which ones to break. He thought about Malcolm's eyes, how they'd assessed him without fear. By morning, those eyes would look different. They always did after the first night. Back at Ironclad, Malcolm lay awake, listening to the prison's night sounds. He'd spent years organizing in neighborhoods where police were feared more than criminals, studying systemic oppression. Now he found himself at the heart of the machine. In the cell across from his, a man sang softly, an old spiritual his grandmother used to hum. The sound anchored him, reminded him why he was here. Not just to survive, but to witness, to resist. When he heard the cell block door opening at 2 a.m., followed by deliberate footsteps, Malcolm didn't pretend to sleep. He didn't cry out for help that wouldn't come. Instead, he stood facing the cell door and waited for the test he knew Bull Hardwick had arranged for him. The first of many. The cell door slid open with a metallic groan. Malcolm stood perfectly still as Wagner and Dupree stepped inside, their bulk filling the narrow entrance. Behind them, Officer Simpson lingered just long enough to whisper, 15 minutes, before walking away, keys jangling in deliberate rhythm down the corridor. "Welcome to Ironclad," Wagner said, rolling his shoulders. White power symbols stretched across his muscled arms. "Heard you've been running your mouth already." Malcolm didn't back away. "I haven't said much at all, actually." "That's not what we heard," Dupree replied, moving to block any path to the door. "We heard you think you're special, that the rules don't apply to you." In the dim light filtering through the corridor, Malcolm could see their anticipation. These men enjoyed violence. It gave them purpose, power, identity. Bull had chosen them carefully. "I know exactly what this is," Malcolm said calmly. "And so does everyone else watching." Wagner's face twisted. "Nobody's watching, Professor. Nobody who gives a damn anyway." The first blow came without further warning, a hard jab to Malcolm's stomach that doubled him over. The second caught his temple as he straightened, sending stars across his vision. He staggered but didn't fall, didn't raise his hands. "Fight back," Dupree hissed, delivering a kidney punch that sent Malcolm to his knees. "Makes it more fun." Malcolm tasted blood, waited for his vision to clear. Then he looked up, meeting their eyes with the same calm assessment he'd given Bull. "I'm not here to fight you." Wagner kicked him in the ribs. "The hell you say?" "I'm not your enemy," Malcolm gasped, struggling to his feet again. "We're all, serving the same master." "Shut up!" Wagner grabbed Malcolm by the throat, slamming him against the concrete wall. The shank Bull had provided glinted in his other hand. "You think you're so smart? Let's see how smart you are with this in your gut." Down the corridor, footsteps approached. Lieutenant Wilkes appeared, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He paused at the cell, illuminating the scene. Malcolm pinned against the wall, blood streaming from his temple. Wagner's hand at his throat, the shank hovering inches from his abdomen. For 3 heartbeats, Wilkes said nothing. His face revealed a war of instincts, duty against complicity, humanity against survival. "Everything okay in here?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. Wagner loosened his grip slightly. "Just having a conversation, Lieutenant. Teaching the new guy about respect." Wilkes's flashlight moved deliberately to the shank, then to Malcolm's bleeding face. "That's enough education for tonight, I think." His tone hardened. "Back to your cells. Now." Wagner and Dupree exchanged glances, weighing their options. Bull's protection against Wilkes's direct order. "Bull won't like this," Wagner muttered, low enough that only Malcolm could hear, before releasing him and pocketing the shank. "We'll finish your orientation another time, Professor." After they left, Wilkes lingered. The flashlight beam dropped to the floor, but not before Malcolm caught something like shame in the lieutenant's eyes. "Medical can see you in the morning," Wilkes said stiffly. Malcolm wiped blood from his mouth. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Wilkes's jaw tightened. "Don't thank me, I'm not your friend." He stepped back, his voice dropping. "And if you're smart, you won't make enemies on your first day." "Too late for that," Malcolm replied, "but they weren't made by me." Wilkes left without responding, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like accusations. In the morning, the evidence of the night's conversation was written across Malcolm's face, a swollen eye, split lip, bruises darkening his brown skin. He sat alone at breakfast, the marks of his beating visible to everyone in the fluorescent cafeteria light. Bull surveyed the scene from his post, frowning when he saw Malcolm upright and eating. Wagner had reported the interruption, but Bull had expected Malcolm to at least stay in his cell, nursing his wounds. Instead, here he was, visible, present, a walking testament to what happened in the darkness of D-Block. More troubling were the glances from other inmates, cautious respect from some of the black prisoners, uneasy curiosity from others. Even a few white inmates watched Malcolm with something other than the contempt Bull had cultivated for years. "He should be in the infirmary," Wilkes said, appearing at Bull's side. Bull's eyes narrowed. "Since when do you care about inmate comfort?" "Lieutenant?" "I don't. But ignoring that kind of damage raises questions, especially for a high-profile prisoner like Tate." "High profile?" Bull scoffed. "He's just another criminal. With connections outside, supporters, community organizations, the kind that file formal complaints." Bull turned to face Wilkes directly. "You interfered last night." "I maintained order," Wilkes replied, meeting his gaze. "That's our job. Our job is to keep this place running smoothly. My way." "Your way nearly. Got him stabbed in his cell." Bull stepped closer. "Careful, Lieutenant. 20 years I've kept the peace here. You questioning my methods now?" Wilkes held his ground. "I'm saying there's a line, even here." Before Bull could respond, a commotion erupted across the cafeteria. Red Carter had sat down across from Malcolm, drawing stares from inmates of all races. In Ironclad's rigid hierarchy, such a public acknowledgement from someone of Red standing was significant. "You trying to make a statement?" Bull heard Red say as he approached their table. Malcolm looked up from his tray. Just trying to eat breakfast. With that face, man, you're screaming without saying a word. Red leaned forward. What's your game? Nobody takes a beating like that without fighting back unless they want something. Maybe I just don't see the point in playing by their rules. Red's scarred face twisted into something between a smile and a sneer. Their rules are the only ones that matter in here. That's what they need us to believe, Malcolm replied quietly. Bull reached their table, baton in hand. Carter, back to your assigned seat now. Red rose slowly, deliberately. Just being neighborly, Sergeant, welcoming our new celebrity. He looked down at Malcolm. We'll talk more, Professor. After Red left, Bull loomed over Malcolm. You're making a mistake, turning my prison into your personal crusade. Malcolm continued eating. Interesting choice of words. Your prison. That's right. Mine. Bull's voice dropped so only Malcolm could hear. And last night was just a sample of what happens to agitators. Next time, I won't send amateurs. There's always a next time with men like you. Malcolm replied, his swollen face impassive. The real question is how many times before everyone sees the truth. And what truth is that? Malcolm finally looked up, his one good eye clear and unflinching. That your power only exists because we allow it. The words hung between them, a declaration of war so quiet that only Bull understood its full implication. 23 years of absolute control suddenly felt less absolute. Bull's radio crackled. Captain Morales wanted him in her office. Now. This isn't over, he growled. No, Malcolm agreed. It's just beginning. Captain Helen Morales's office was a study in institutional efficiency. Every surface clean, every file precisely arranged. She stood when Bull entered, her dark hair pulled back severely, her uniform pressed to regulation perfection. What the hell happened to Tate? She demanded without preamble. Bull shrugged. Probably mouthed off to the wrong inmate. First-timers make mistakes. He was assigned to B block, you put him in D. Why? I made a judgment call based on security concerns. Morales's eyes narrowed. Bull, I've tolerated your judgment calls for years because you keep the peace. But Tate isn't some nobody. He has lawyers, supporters, a congressman asking questions about his case. All the more reason to show him who's in charge. The warden received 2 calls this morning, one from Tate's attorney, one from a journalist. Morales tossed a file on her desk. So now I'm asking you, what happened? Nothing that hasn't happened 100 times before, Bull replied. He'll learn, or he'll suffer. Simple as that. Not this time. Morales's voice hardened. Warden Pritchard wants him seen by medical, photographed, statement taken. By the book. Bull felt heat rising in his neck. Since when does Pritchard care about one inmate getting roughed up? Since that inmate became a potential PR nightmare. She leaned forward. You've had free rein here because what happens inside stays inside. But if Tate makes enough noise to reach outside these walls, all of us will face scrutiny none of us want. Bull knew she was right, though he'd never admit it. Prisons operated on a delicate balance of official policy and unspoken practice. Men like him existed in the gap between what the state claimed happened and what actually did. I'll handle Tate, he said finally. No, you won't. Morales straightened. He's being transferred back to B block this afternoon, under Lieutenant Wilkes's supervision. Wilkes? Bull couldn't hide his surprise. Since when do you trust him? With sensitive cases? Since I need someone who follows proper procedure. Her eyes met his. Take the day off, Bull. Cool down. This isn't a request. Bull left Morales's office seething. In the corridor, he passed Wilkes heading in, no doubt, to receive his new assignment. The younger officer nodded respectfully, but Bull caught the subtle shift in his demeanor, a confidence that hadn't been there yesterday. By afternoon, word of Malcolm's transfer had spread through Ironclad like wildfire. Bull watched from the administrative wing as Malcolm was escorted from D block to B, his few possessions in a prison issue bag, his injuries visible to everyone they passed. It was exactly what Malcolm wanted, Bull realized. To be seen, to create questions. Already the normal rhythms of the prison were disrupted by whispers, by glances, by the spectacle of a man who refused to play by the unwritten rules. As Malcolm passed through the central yard, Red fell into step beside him, flanked by two of his lieutenants. Bull couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Malcolm nod, saw the calculating respect in Red's eyes. A dangerous alliance was forming, and for the first time in years, Bull felt something he'd almost forgotten: uncertainty. That night, alone in his house, Bull cleaned his service revolver with meticulous care, the routine usually calming his mind. Not today. Today his thoughts churned like storm clouds. One man, one beaten, bruised, seemingly powerless man had disrupted the careful system Bull had built over decades, not with violence or confrontation, but by simply refusing to participate in the expected script. Bull reassembled his weapon, the metal parts clicking into place with satisfying precision. He would need a new approach. Malcolm Tate wasn't just another inmate to be broken. He was a threat to everything Bull had built. The game had changed, and Bull would have to change with it, or risk losing everything. 3 weeks after his transfer to B block, Malcolm sat, in the prison library, a worn legal textbook open before him. The bruises on his face had faded to yellowish shadows, but their impact lingered throughout Ironclad. Inmates who once avoided his gaze now nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Some even sought him out, whispering stories of their own beatings, frame-ups, and humiliations. Malcolm listened, memorized names, dates, patterns, and he wrote, tiny, precise notes on paper smuggled from the administrative office by an inmate, janitor who'd watched Malcolm take that beating without breaking. "Mail call in 5, announced the library guard, barely glancing up from his magazine. Malcolm closed the textbook and slid his notes into the binding of another book, a tattered copy of Gandhi's autobiography that few inmates bothered with. The hiding place was temporary. The notes would soon continue their journey outward through a network that grew more intricate each day. A kitchen worker with outside delivery privileges, a maintenance trustee with access to the parking lot, a guard's cousin who visited every Thursday. Each link in the chain knew only their part, plausible deniability that protected them all. That afternoon in the yard, Malcolm spotted Lieutenant Wilkes watching him from the guard tower. Their eyes met briefly before Wilkes looked away, but not before. Malcolm recognized the troubled questioning in his gaze. The lieutenant had been different since that night, more vigilant, less willing to overlook the casual cruelties that defined Ironclad. "Boss wants to know what you're planning," said Red, appearing beside Malcolm as they walked the perimeter of the exercise yard. By unspoken agreement, they kept a careful distance as they talked, nothing that would draw attention. "I'm not planning anything," Malcolm replied. "Just serving my time." Red snorted. "Man, don't waste my intelligence. Something's happening. Inmates skipping mess hall to talk with you, notes passing between blocks, guards getting the cold shoulder." Malcolm kept, his pace steady. "People are just tired of pretending this is normal." "This is normal," Red countered. "This is prison. Bull's been running things this way for decades." "And that doesn't bother you? A white supremacist deciding which of us lives or dies?" Red's scarred face hardened. "What bothers me is survival. I've built something here. Protection, respect, a business. I can't risk that for whatever crusade you're on." "I'm not asking you to," Malcolm said, his voice low but intense. "I'm just suggesting there's power in refusing to play their game." Red was silent for several steps. "You sound like my grandfather. He used to talk about sit-ins, boycotts, all that civil rights stuff." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Old man got his skull cracked open in Selma. Did it change anything?" "Maybe." Red shrugged. "But he died poor and broken anyway." Malcolm stopped walking. "What happens when Bull decides your business is inconvenient, or when some new guard decides to make an example of you?" Red's eyes narrowed. I handle it. Alone? Malcolm asked. Because that's how they want us, divided, fighting each other instead of the real enemy. Before Red could answer, a commotion erupted across the yard. 2 white inmates had cornered a younger, black prisoner against the fence. Bull and Officer Kendrick watched from nearby, making no move to intervene. See that? Malcolm nodded toward the scene. That's by design. Bull's hoping I'll rush over there, try to help, give him an excuse. Instead of moving toward the confrontation, Malcolm raised his voice just enough to be heard by nearby inmates. Interesting how some guards only see trouble when it's convenient. Heads turned. More inmates began watching the situation by the fence, their attention now split between the potential fight and the guards deliberately ignoring it. The hell are you doing? Red muttered. Changing the audience, Malcolm replied. As if on cue, 3 older black inmates casually repositioned themselves near the confrontation, not intervening, not threatening, just witnessing. Then 2 Latino prisoners joined them, then others. The white instigators faltered, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes focused not just on them, but on Bull's inaction. The young black inmate slipped away during their moment of uncertainty. Bull's face darkened as he realized what had happened. No fight, no excuse for lockdown or disciplinary action, just his deliberate negligence exposed for all to see. Too many witnesses, Malcolm said quietly. Even Bull can't control everyone's eyes. Red studied him with new calculation. I'll be watching you, Tate, but I'm not picking sides. That's a start, Malcolm replied. Later that day, the effects of Malcolm's subtle resistance began rippling through Ironclad's carefully controlled ecosystem. In the laundry, inmates worked at half speed, ignoring the shouted orders of frustrated guards. In the mess hall, trays were returned with food barely touched. Not a hunger strike, nothing so obvious but enough to disrupt routine. Most telling were the silences. Inmates who once responded to racist taunts with predictable anger now stared through guards as if they were invisible. The provocations that Bull and his officers had weaponized for years suddenly lost their power when met with indifference. By evening count, Bull was seething. He stalked B-Block's corridor, baton slapping against his palm as he searched for a specific target for his frustration. Tate, he barked, stopping at Malcolm's cell, front and center. Malcolm rose unhurriedly from his bunk. Yes, Sergeant? You think I don't know what you're doing? Bull's voice was low, dangerous. Turning my prison into some kind of demonstration? I'm not sure what you mean, Malcolm replied, his tone perfectly respectful, yet somehow hollow of actual deference. Cut the act. You've been here a month, and suddenly my inmates are acting like they've got rights. Malcolm's expression remained neutral. Everyone has rights, Sergeant, even in here. Bull leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. I've buried inmates smarter than you, Tate. Men who thought they could change things. They're in unmarked graves behind the east fence. Is that supposed to frighten me? It's supposed to educate you. Bull's eyes were cold. This little movement of yours ends now, or there will be consequences beyond anything you've experienced. Malcolm said nothing for a long moment, just held Bull's gaze. Then, the difference between us, Sergeant, is that I've already accepted the consequences. Have you? The implied threat that Malcolm's resistance could cost Bull far more than it would cost him hung in the air between them. Bull's hand tightened on his baton, knuckles white with restrained violence. 1 week in solitary, he finally said. Insubordination. Malcolm nodded slightly as if he'd been expecting this. Of course. As 2 guards arrived to escort Malcolm to solitary, inmates along the block fell silent, watching. No protests, no outbursts, just synchronized attention that made even the guards uneasy. What are you looking at? Bull shouted at the row of expressionless faces. Next man who doesn't have his eyes on the floor gets to join him. No one moved, no one spoke, but neither did they look away. For the first time in 2 decades, Bull felt the unsettling sensation of having lost control of the narrative. This wasn't the reaction he'd cultivated through years of divide-and-conquer tactics. This silent, unified witnessing was something new, something dangerous. In the administrative wing, Lieutenant Wilkes sat alone in the darkened records room, Malcolm's file open before him. He'd pulled it officially, citing a security review, but his interest went far beyond procedure. The police report described Malcolm as the instigator of violence at what had been, by all other accounts, a peaceful protest against police brutality. Photos showed Malcolm allegedly swinging at an officer, but the angle was suspicious, the lighting convenient. Multiple witness statements contradicted the official narrative, but all had been flagged as unreliable by the arresting officers. Most damning was a memo from the district attorney to the judge, never meant to be part of the public record but mistakenly included in the file, suggesting Malcolm's case should send a message to these community agitators. Wilkes closed the file, his conscience heavier than when he'd opened it. For years he'd told himself he was just doing his job, maintaining order in a place that would descend into chaos without strict control. He'd rationalized Bull's methods as necessary evils, looked away when lines were crossed. But Tate's case wasn't about prison management or security protocols. It was about silencing a voice that threatened power, and Wilkes had become complicit in perpetuating that injustice. The sound of the door opening startled him. Captain Morales entered, eyebrows raising when she saw him. "Working late, Lieutenant?" Wilkes nodded, sliding the file under some paperwork. "Just reviewing some security concerns." Morales's eyes flicked to the partially hidden folder. "Tate?" "Yes, ma'am." She sat on the edge of the desk. "Bull put him in solitary tonight." "I heard. Did you also hear about the response in B Block?" When Wilkes shook his head, she continued. Complete silence. No complaints, no resistance. Just watching. Like they were memorizing every detail. Wilkes absorbed this. "That's unusual." "It's unprecedented," Morales corrected. "And frankly, it's more concerning than a riot. I can control violence. I don't know how to control whatever this is." "Maybe it's not something we should control," Wilkes said carefully. Morales studied him. "Careful, Lieutenant, that's dangerous thinking." "So is ignoring what's happening." Wilkes met her gaze. Bull's methods worked when fear kept everyone divided. But Tate is changing the equation. "Is that admiration I hear?" Wilkes chose his words carefully. "It's recognition that we might be on the wrong side of this." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morales's expression hardened. "There are no sides, Lieutenant. Only order and chaos. Our job is to maintain the former and prevent the latter, by any means necessary." She stood. "I suggest you remember that before your career becomes collateral damage." After she left, Wilkes remained at the desk, her warning echoing in his mind. 20 years he'd worked in corrections, climbing the ranks through unwavering loyalty to the system. His pension was just 5 years away. His family depended on his salary, his stability, and yet, for the first time, he found himself questioning whether the price of that security was too high. In solitary confinement, Malcolm sat cross-legged on the floor of his cell, eyes closed in meditation. The space was barely 6 feet by 9, with a concrete slab for a bed, a stainless steel toilet, and a sliver of window too high and narrow to see through. The air was stale, the light perpetually dim. For most inmates, solitary was psychological, torture, the isolation breaking them in ways physical pain couldn't. But Malcolm had prepared for this, had almost expected it as the next move in Bull's playbook. What Bull didn't understand was that removing Malcolm from general population wouldn't stop what he'd started. The seeds had been planted, in the silent witnesses who watched his removal, in the network that would continue passing information outside, in the growing realization among inmates that their greatest power lay in unified non-compliance. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Malcolm opened his eyes as a food tray slid through the slot in his door. "Dinner," announced a voice he recognized as Officer Simpson's. Malcolm didn't move. After a moment, Simpson spoke again, quieter. They're still watching, you know. The whole B block, nobody's fighting, nobody's talking much, just waiting. Malcolm rose and approached the door. Is there something you want to tell me, Officer Simpson? A pause. I've worked here 12 years. Never seen anything like it. Another hesitation. Some of the other guards, and they're talking about Bull, about how things are changing. Change is inevitable, Malcolm said. The question is whether it comes through wisdom or pain. Simpson was silent for so long Malcolm thought he'd left. Then, there's a letter for you. Came today. Bull ordered it withheld. And yet you're telling me about it. I've got 3 years to retirement, Simpson muttered. I just want to finish clean, you know. No more of Bull's special assignments. Malcolm pressed his palm against the cold metal door. It doesn't have to be this way, Officer Simpson. Not for any of us. After Simpson left, Malcolm returned to his meditation position, a slight smile on his face. Even here in isolation, the resistance continued. One conversation, one awakening conscience at a time. Meanwhile, in Ironclad's administrative wing, Warden Pritchard was holding an emergency meeting with Captain Morales and senior staff. The situation is deteriorating, Pritchard said, his politician's face grave. Productivity is down 40%. Incident reports have tripled, and now I'm getting calls from the Department of Corrections about Tate. I told you he was trouble, Bull interjected. We should transfer him, get him out of Ironclad before he can do more damage. Morales shook her head. Transfer would only validate his narrative, make him a martyr. Then what do you suggest? Pritchard demanded. Because right now one inmate is undermining my entire prison. Give me time, Bull said. I'll find something on him that sticks. Something that will discredit him with the other inmates. Pritchard nodded slowly. Do it, whatever it takes. Just contain this before it reaches the press or, God forbid, the governor's office. As the meeting ended, Bull stayed behind, mind already racing with possibilities. Malcolm Tate had proven resistant to intimidation and violence, but every man had weaknesses, vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Bull would find Tate's, and, when he did, this little revolution would collapse like the house of cards it was. What Bull couldn't see, what none of them fully grasped yet, was that Malcolm had already changed the game. The power that had seemed absolute for decades now revealed itself as fragile, dependent on compliance and fear, and both were beginning to fade. Malcolm stepped out of solitary after his week-long confinement, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light of the main corridor. His body felt stiff, his eyes sensitive after days in near darkness, but his resolve remained unbroken. If anything, the isolation had strengthened his purpose, given him time to plan his next moves in this chess match with Bull. Lieutenant Wilkes waited to escort him back to B Block. You holding up? He asked quietly as they walked. No other guards. Within earshot. I've been in tighter spots, Malcolm replied, noting the lieutenant's unusual concern. Wilkes kept his eyes forward. Things have been tense while you were gone. Bull's on edge, looking for any excuse to crack down. And the other inmates? Quieter than I've ever seen, but there's something different about it, like they're waiting for something. Wilkes glanced at him. Whatever you started, it didn't stop when they put you in the hole. Malcolm absorbed this information with careful neutrality. I didn't start anything that wasn't already there, Lieutenant. Just helped people see it. As they entered B Block, Malcolm felt the shift immediately. Inmates looked up from their activities, whispers spreading like ripples across still water. No cheers, no obvious acknowledgement, nothing that would give guards reason to intervene. But the awareness of his return hummed through the cell block like an electric current. Red Carter was playing cards at a table near the common area. He didn't look up as Malcolm passed, but his deep voice carried just enough for Malcolm to hear. Library. 2 hours. Malcolm settled back into his cell, finding his few possessions undisturbed. He sat on his bunk, closed his eyes, and took a moment to center himself. One battle survived, the next already beginning. Bull Hardwick stood in the prison storage room with Officer Kendrick, inventorying a recent contraband seizure. Homemade weapons, drugs smuggled in by visitors, prohibited electronics. The official count was already logged in the system, which meant what happened next would never appear in any record. This one, Bull decided, selecting a crude knife fashioned from a sharpened piece of metal bed frame. Its handle was wrapped, in fabric torn from a prison uniform. And this. He added a small bag of white powder. Kendrick shifted uncomfortably. Heroin, Sarge? That's a serious charge. That's the point. Bull's face was hard as concrete. I want him gone, not just in solitary, transferred to maximum security. Tate doesn't seem like the type to mess with drugs. Bull's eyes narrowed. You questioning me now too, Kendrick? First Wilkes, now you? No, sir, Kendrick replied quickly. Just making sure we're covered. We're covered. The search will be by the book. Multiple witnesses, ironclad evidence. Bull smiled thinly at his own pun. By tomorrow, Malcolm Tate will be on his way to Stallworth State Prison, where they handled the worst of the worst. Problem solved. Kendrick nodded, but couldn't quite meet Bull's eyes. When are we doing this? Tonight, dinner shift when most inmates are in the mess hall. Bull pocketed the contraband. I'll handle the search personally. All you need to do is back me up when I find what I'm looking for. After Kendrick left, Bull remained in the storage room, rehearsing the plan in his mind. It was neat, efficient, and most importantly, final. He'd used similar methods dozens of times over the years to remove troublesome inmates, men who asked too many questions, who threatened to expose corruption, who refused to bow to the natural order he'd established. Tate was just another name on that list. The fact that he'd lasted this long was an anomaly, a mistake Bull would soon correct. In the prison library, Malcolm sat at a corner table with a book open before him. Though his attention was on Red, Carter and the small group of trusted inmates who had positioned themselves strategically around the room, creating a pocket of relative privacy in a place where true privacy didn't exist. Heard you had a peaceful vacation, Red said, his voice low. Quiet at least, Malcolm replied. What did I miss? Bull's planning something. My sources say he was in the contraband lockup earlier talking to Kendrick about transfers. Malcolm nodded, having anticipated this move. He wants me gone. Can you blame him? You've got half the guards looking over their shoulders and inmates actually thinking for themselves. Red leaned forward. It's bad for business, his and mine. Yet here you are warning me. Red's scarred face revealed nothing. Maybe I'm just curious to see how the story ends. Before Malcolm could respond, another inmate, a young Latino man named Santos who worked in the administrative office, approached their table, sliding a book across to Malcolm with deliberate casualness. Page 43, he murmured before walking away. Malcolm opened the book to find a folded piece of paper tucked inside. He palmed it smoothly, never breaking eye contact with Red. You've been busy, Red observed. Information is power in here. Bull knows it. So do I. Red snorted. Difference is Bull has the badges and batons on his side. For now, Malcolm replied. But badges can change hands. Loyalties shift when people see the truth. Red studied him for a long moment. You really believe you can change things, don't you? Not just survive this place, but transform it. I believe we can. Together. Malcolm held Red's gaze. Bull's power depends on us fighting each other instead of the real enemy. What happens when that stops? Chaos, probably. Or justice, Malcolm countered. A chance to serve our time with dignity instead of under a boot. Red laughed softly. Man, I haven't heard talk like that in here for years. His expression sobered, but I've seen reform movements come and go. They always end the same way. This time is different, Malcolm said, because this time we have evidence. He tapped his pocket where the note was hidden. And we have something Bull can never understand. What's that? Patience, Malcolm replied. The willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than ourselves. Red was silent for a long moment, then, Bull's coming for you tonight, during dinner. A search. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but his mind raced through implications and options. You're sure? My cell is next to the guard station. Heard Kendrick telling Simpson to be ready for a special inspection. Red's eyes narrowed. You get caught with whatever he plants, you're looking at added time, harder time. I need to get word out before that happens, Malcolm said, in case things go badly. Red considered this, then made a decision that surprised even himself. I know someone who can help. Trustee with outside privileges, but it'll cost you. I don't have money or favors to trade. I'm not talking about that kind of payment. Red leaned closer. I want to know what you're really planning, not this peaceful resistance talk. The end game. Malcolm met his gaze without flinching. Justice for everyone Bull has hurt. Accountability for a system that profits from our suffering. The truth reaching beyond these walls. That's it? No revenge? No power grab? What would I do with Bull's kind of power? Malcolm asked. It's poison. It corrupts everyone who touches it. Red searched his face for deception and found none. Finally, he nodded. I'll get your message out. But not because I believe we can change this place, because men like Bull shouldn't always win. They don't, Malcolm said quietly. History proves that. The question is what price we're willing to pay to be on the right side of that history. Wilkes sat in his car in the prison parking lot, the engine off, staring at his phone. On the screen was a draft text message to a journalist whose card he'd kept after a story about prison reform last year. His thumb hovered over the send button, the message detailing Bull's planned frame-up of Malcolm Tate. Send it and his career was over. 20 years of service sacrificed, his family's security jeopardized. Don't send it. And he remained complicit in an injustice he could no longer pretend to ignore. A knock on his window startled him. Captain Morales stood outside, her expression unreadable. Wilkes hastily locked his phone screen before rolling down the window. Captain, something wrong? That's what I was going to ask you, she replied. You've been sitting out here for 30 minutes. Wilkes forced a smile. Just, gathering my thoughts before heading home. Morales studied him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Bull's conducting a search of Tate's cell tonight. He's requested you not be present. Why would he? Wilkes stopped himself, understanding immediately. He's planting evidence. Morales's expression didn't change. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Wilkes met her gaze. You know what he's doing. And you're allowing it. I'm allowing order to be maintained, she replied coolly. Something you used to value. There's a difference between order and injustice, Captain. Not in here, there isn't. Morales leaned closer. Listen to me carefully, Lieutenant. You have a good record, a promising future. Don't throw it away on some misguided crusade for a convict who won't thank you for it. Wilkes looked down at his phone, then back at Morales. What if Tate doesn't deserve what's happening to him? What if none of them do? Deserve? Morales's laugh was brittle. We don't deal in what people deserve. We deal in what maintains the system. And right now, Tate threatens that system. Maybe the system needs threatening, Wilkes said quietly. Morales's expression hardened. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, for your sake. She straightened. Go home, Lieutenant. Whatever happens tonight isn't your concern. As she walked away, Wilkes looked again at his unsent message. The right thing and the easy thing rarely aligned. Tonight, he had to choose which path he could live with. Dinner hour at Ironclad was the usual controlled chaos. Hundreds of inmates moving through the serving line, the clatter of trays and institutional conversation creating a dull roar. Malcolm sat with a group of older inmates, aware of the clock ticking toward Bull's planned discovery in his cell. His written account of Bull's abuses and systemic corruption at Ironclad was already making its way outside, thanks to Red's surprising intervention. Whether it would arrive in time to make a difference remained to be seen. Across the mess hall, Bull entered with Kendrick and two other guards. their presence causing a subtle ripple of tension. Bull's eyes locked on Malcolm immediately, a predatory anticipation in his gaze. "Showtime," Malcolm murmured to his companions. Bull approached their table, baton tapping rhythmically against his palm. "Tate, you're needed for questioning." Malcolm kept his expression neutral. "What about, Sergeant?" "Information about contraband, moving through B block." Bull's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unless you'd rather we discuss it here in front of everyone." Malcolm rose slowly. "Of course, Sergeant." As Bull led him out, Malcolm noticed something unexpected. Inmates throughout the mess hall were standing too. Not rushing forward, not creating a disturbance, just standing, silently watching. The gesture spread like a wave until half the room was on its feet. Bull felt it too, his back stiffening as he sensed hundreds of eyes tracking their exit. "Sit down," he barked, but the command lacked its usual authority. When no one moved, his face flushed dark with rage and something new, uncertainty. In the corridor outside, Bull grabbed Malcolm's arm roughly. "What the hell was that?" "People paying attention," Malcolm replied calmly. "Witnesses. Won't matter. By morning, you'll be on your way to Stallworth with a weapons and drug charge." Malcolm didn't resist as Bull marched him toward B block. "We both know what you're doing, Sergeant. The question is, how many others know too?" Bull's grip tightened painfully. "You think I care what these animals think? I've outlasted dozens like you, Tate. Men who thought they could change things. Not like me," Malcolm said quietly. "Not like this." When they reached Malcolm's cell, a small crowd of guards had already gathered. Kendrick and Simpson, two other officers Malcolm recognized from night shifts, and unexpectedly, Lieutenant Wilkes. Bull's steps faltered. "Lieutenant? Didn't expect to. See you here tonight." "Thought I should witness this search personally," Wilkes replied, his voice professionally neutral, but his eyes conveying something else entirely, given Tate's high profile. Bull's jaw tightened, but he couldn't object without raising suspicion. "Fine. Kendrick, Simpson, conduct the search. By the book." Malcolm stood quietly as the guards entered his cell, tearing apart his meager possessions with methodical thoroughness. Bull watched from the doorway, his confidence visibly wavering as minutes passed without discovery. "Check the mattress," Bull ordered, his voice sharp with frustration. Kendrick sliced open the thin mattress, probing its stuffing. His movements grew increasingly frantic as he found nothing. "It's clean, Sarge." "That's impossible," Bull hissed. "Check again." While this played out, Malcolm's eyes met Wilkes's. The lieutenant gave him an almost imperceptible nod, confirmation of intervention Malcolm hadn't dared hope for. After 15 minutes of increasingly desperate searching, Bull pushed past Kendrick and entered the cell himself. "You're all useless," he growled, beginning his own search. When he finally emerged, empty-handed and fuming, the corridor had filled with inmates returning from dinner, forming a silent gauntlet. Among them stood Red Carter, arms crossed, a satisfied gleam in his eye. "Nothing," Bull announced, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "But we'll be conducting random searches all week. This isn't over." As the crowd dispersed, Red approached Malcolm. "Guess he didn't find what he was looking for," he said, just loud enough for nearby guards to hear. "Guess not," Malcolm replied, understanding dawning. "Seems things have a way of disappearing around here." Red smiled thinly. "And reappearing, where they do the most good." He nodded toward Bull's retreating back. Warden Pritchard might be interested in what was found during a routine inspection of the guard's locker room tonight. Anonymous tip. Malcolm stared at him. "You didn't." "Like you said, information is power." Red's scarred face broke into a rare, genuine smile. "Sometimes the game changes, Professor. Even for old-timers like me." That night, as Malcolm lay, in his intact cell, the prison buzzed with the news. Bull Hardwick was under investigation. Contraband had been found in his locker, items matching those missing from the official inventory. Warden Pritchard, ever conscious of political fallout, had been forced to suspend Bull pending a formal inquiry. It was a temporary victory, Malcolm, Sanu. Bull had too many allies, too much leverage accumulated over decades. But it had bought them time. And more importantly, it had shown everyone in Ironclad something they'd forgotten was possible. That the powerful could be vulnerable too. In his office, Warden Pritchard faced both Captain Morales and Lieutenant Wilkes, his politician's face grave with concern. "This is a disaster," he said, pacing behind his desk. "Bull suspended, rumors flying, inmates watching our every move." "It'll blow over," Morales assured him. "Bull's been through worse." "Has he?" Pritchard demanded. "You blaming me now?" "I'm saying your methods worked until they didn't." She leaned forward. "Bull, the world is changing. Body cameras, social media, oversight committees. We can't operate like it's 1995 anymore. So we just let them take over? Let Tate dictate how my prison runs?" Morales' eyebrow raised slightly at the "my." "What I'm saying is, we need to be smarter, more strategic." Bull leaned on her desk. "I have a strategy. Break their spirit, remind them who's in charge." "And how do you propose to do that?" "Collective punishment," Bull said flatly. "Every black inmate in B and C blocks on lockdown. Reduced rations, no privileges, no yard time, no visitation." Morales stared at him. "That's not just against policy, it's illegal. Racial targeting." "Call it a security measure," Bull interrupted. "Response to credible threats of gang violence." Pritchard would never approve it. Bull's smile was cold. "Pritchard doesn't need to know the details, just the results." Morales studied him for a long moment. "You're desperate, Bull, and desperate men make mistakes. The only mistake I made was not crushing Tate from the beginning." He straightened. "You with me or against me, Helen?" She didn't answer immediately, weighing 2 decades of complicity against the growing risk of staying aligned with him. "Do what you need to do," she finally said. "But keep my name out of it." It was all the permission Bull needed. The lockdown began without warning. Guards swarmed B and C blocks at 5 a.m., dragging black inmates from their beds, forcing them against walls, conducting invasive searches. Those who questioned were met with batons, those who resisted with worse. "Security protocol," the guards repeated mechanically. "Intelligence about planned violence." By breakfast, the new reality was clear. Black inmates confined to cells 23 hours a day. Meals reduced to bare minimum. All privileges revoked indefinitely. White inmates watched with unease, some with satisfaction, others recognizing they could be next if they stepped out of line. In the solitary wing, Malcolm listened to the distant sounds of the lockdown, shouts, the thud of batons, the metallic slam of cell doors, and understood immediately what was happening. Bull was escalating, targeting not just Malcolm himself but everyone who looked like him. It was a desperate move, revealing Bull's weakening position. But it would cause real suffering before it backfired. Lieutenant Wilkes supervised reluctantly, his face a mask of professional detachment that did nothing to hide his inner turmoil, when Officer Simpson shoved an older black inmate too roughly, sending the man crashing into a wall. Wilkes intervened. "That's enough," he said sharply. "We're maintaining order, not creating chaos." Simpson glanced toward Bull, who stood watching, from the end of the corridor. "Just following orders, Lieutenant." "Follow mine," Wilkes replied, his voice hard. "No unnecessary force." The tension between them drew Bull's attention. He approached slowly, baton tapping rhythmically against his palm. "Problem, Lieutenant?" "Just clarifying procedures," Wilkes answered evenly. Bull's eyes moved from Wilkes to Simpson and back. "My procedures are clear. Anyone resists, they learn what happens when they challenge the natural order." "The natural order," Wilkes repeated, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. "Is that what we're enforcing now?" "Watch yourself, Lieutenant," Bull warned. "Sides are being chosen. Make sure you're on the right one." As Bull moved away, the cell phone in Wilkes's pocket felt suddenly heavier. He'd started recording after the investigation into Bull collapsed, documenting the escalating abuses. Dozens of videos now, evidence of a system rotting from within. Each day brought fresh footage and fresh guilt for not using it sooner. But releasing it would mean the end of his career. Maybe worse, given the powerful people implicated in the corruption. For a man with a family, a mortgage, 3 kids in college, the risk was enormous. Yet watching what was unfolding around him, Wilkes wondered if he could live with the alternative. 3 days into the lockdown, the atmosphere in Ironclad had transformed from tense to explosive. The racial targeting was blatant, with black inmates suffering while white inmates received extra privileges, better food, additional yard time, preferential work assignments. But Bull's strategy wasn't working as planned. Instead of breaking morale, the collective punishment had united the black inmates in defiance. When guards delivered the reduced meal trays, inmates refused to take them. When ordered to perform routine tasks, they moved with deliberate, maddening slowness. Most effective was the noise. At precisely midnight, every locked-down inmate began banging on their cell door in unison. Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like the beginning of something, not the end. He turned to Wilkes. Your assessment, Lieutenant? Wilkes chose his words carefully. The dynamics are changing, sir. Bull's methods depended on fear and division. Tate has found a way to counter both. So what do we do? Pritchard asked. Transfer Tate anyway? Crack down harder? That would only validate his narrative, Wilkes replied, echoing Morales's earlier words with deliberate irony. Make him a martyr. Morales shot him a look that mixed irritation with reluctant respect. He's right. We need a more subtle approach. What do you suggest? Pritchard asked. Divide and conquer, Morales said. Find Tate's weakness. Everyone has one. Wilkes remained silent, but his mind raced with conflict. He'd chosen a side tonight, prevented an injustice. But how far would his newfound conscience take him? How much was he willing to risk? As the meeting concluded, Pritchard held Wilkes back. A word, Lieutenant. When they were alone, Pritchard studied him intently. You've been at Ironclad a long time, seen how things work. Yes, sir. Then you understand that institutions like ours require flexibility in how rules are applied. Wilkes met his gaze steadily. I used to believe that, sir. And now? Now I wonder if that flexibility has become an excuse for something else entirely. Pritchard's expression hardened. Be careful, Lieutenant. Bull Hardwick may be suspended, but he still has friends. Powerful friends who wouldn't appreciate a disruption to the status quo. Is that a threat, sir? It's reality, Pritchard replied. The choice is yours. Be part of the solution, or become part of the problem. As Wilkes left the warden's office, he felt the weight of that choice pressing down on him. For 20 years, he'd been part of a system he now recognized as fundamentally corrupt. Changing course wouldn't be easy or safe, but watching Malcolm Tate stand tall against Bull's intimidation had awakened something in him, a reminder of the ideals that had led him to corrections in the first place. The belief that justice should apply to everyone, even though society, had locked away. Back in his cell, Malcolm prepared for bed, aware that tonight's victory was just one skirmish in a longer war. Bull would return, perhaps more dangerous than before. The warden and Morales would regroup, find new approaches to silence him. But something had shifted in Ironclad tonight, a rebalancing of power that went beyond one failed frame-up. For the first time, inmates had witnessed the possibility of accountability. They'd seen Bull Hardwick, the untouchable tyrant, forced to answer for his actions. More importantly, they'd seen it happen because they stood together, because they watched, because they refused to look away. Malcolm closed his eyes, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. But he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Red's unexpected alliance, Wilkes's quiet intervention, the silent solidarity of hundreds of watching eyes, all were signs that the tide was beginning to turn. The question was whether it would turn quickly enough to save him from what came next. 2 weeks after Bull's suspension, Ironclad hovered in an uneasy equilibrium. The contraband charges against him had been quietly dropped. Too many powerful people had too much to lose if Bull decided to talk. But his return came with conditions. He was on probation, his authority diminished, his every move scrutinized. For Bull, this humiliation was intolerable. He'd built his empire on the perception of absolute power. Now, inmates looked at him differently, some with barely concealed satisfaction, others with a new calculation in their eyes measuring his weakened position. He sat in the guard's break room, staring at the coffee growing cold in his mug. The conversation among officers died when he entered, replaced by awkward silence. Once they would have welcomed him with deference, eager to curry favor. Now they watched him like a wounded predator, still dangerous but vulnerable. Enough of this, Bull muttered to himself, standing abruptly. He'd spent 23 years building his kingdom. He wouldn't lose it to Malcolm Tate or anyone else. In the administration wing, he found Captain Morales reviewing incident reports, her office door open. She glanced up as he entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Bull?" she acknowledged. "Feeling better?" "Cut the crap, Helen," he replied, closing the door behind him. "We both know what's happening here." Morales set down her pen. "And what's that?" "Tate's little revolution is spreading. Inmates refusing to work. Guards looking the other way. Everything we built coming apart." "What we built," Morales repeated, a slight edge to her voice, "was a system to maintain order. If that system is failing, perhaps the problem isn't with the inmates." Bull's eyes narrowed. The sound echoed through the facility like a heartbeat, impossible to ignore, continuing for exactly 1 hour before stopping as suddenly as it had begun. In the solitary wing, Malcolm listened to this rhythmic protest with quiet satisfaction. He couldn't communicate directly with the general population, but he didn't need to. The ideas he'd planted had taken root, growing beyond his direct influence. Red Carter had emerged as an unexpected leader in Malcolm's absence. Though officially, under the same restrictions as other black inmates, Red's network of influence reached throughout Ironclad. Guards who once looked the other way for his profitable contraband trade continued to grant him limited movement, unaware that his priorities had shifted. In the prison laundry, Red met with the leaders of Latino and Asian inmate groups, meetings that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "Bull's desperate," Red told them. "Targeting us now, but you'll be next if he regains control." Santos, the leader of the Latino inmates, remained skeptical. "Why should we risk what we have for your fight?" "Because it's not just our fight anymore," Red replied. "It's about whether any of us have rights in here or if we're just animals in Bull's private zoo." Wong, who represented the smaller Asian population, nodded slowly. "The guards are divided, I've seen it. Some don't like what's happening." "Exactly," Red said. "The system's cracking. Bull knows it. That's why he's getting more extreme." By the end of the meeting, a new alliance had formed, not based on race or gang affiliation, but on a shared recognition that Bull's reign of terror could only end if they stood united against it. In the administrative wing, Warden Pritchard paced behind his desk, his politician's composure crumbling under pressure. "5 days of this," he exclaimed. "Constant noise complaints, productivity down 60%, incident reports piling up. And now I've got the Department of Corrections asking questions about alleged racial discrimination in our lockdown procedures." Captain Morales stood at attention, her face carefully neutral. "The situation is challenging, sir." "Challenging?" Pritchard stopped pacing to glare at her. "It's a disaster, and where's Bull? This was his brilliant strategy, and I haven't seen him all day." "He's addressing disciplinary issues in C Block," Morales replied, omitting that these issues, largely, consisted of Bull personally overseeing punishments for inmates who'd been most vocal in the protests. "Call him in," Pritchard ordered. "Now." While they waited, Pritchard stared at the incident report spread across his desk. "Do you know what happens to wardens when their prisons become newsworthy, Captain? They become former wardens very quickly." "Sir, I've spent 15 years climbing the correctional administration ladder," Pritchard continued. 15 years of keeping my head down, following the playbook, making sure Ironclad stays out of headlines. He looked up at her. I won't. Let Bull Hardwick's vendetta against one inmate destroy everything I've built. When Bull finally arrived, still in riot gear from his disciplinary activities, the tension in the office was palpable. You wanted to see me, Warden? He asked, not bothering to sound respectful. This ends now, Pritchard said flatly. The lockdown, the racial targeting, all of it. Bull's eyes narrowed. With all due respect, sir, we're in the middle of restoring order. Restoring? Pritchard laughed bitterly. The place was running smoothly until you decided to wage personal war on Tate. Now I've got the doc threatening an investigation, guards filing complaints about excessive force, and a prison on the verge of riot. Complaints? Bull's head swiveled. Toward Morales. What complaints? Morales met his gaze steadily. 3 officers have formally documented concerns about racial targeting in the lockdown protocols. Who? Bull demanded. That's confidential, she replied, but Lieutenant Wilkes was one of them. Bull's face darkened. Wilkes is a problem that needs solving. No, Pritchard interjected. No more of your solutions, Bull. They're what got us here. He straightened, finding his bureaucratic spine. The lockdown ends tomorrow. Tate returns to general population, and you take a week's leave while I decide whether there's still a place for you at Ironclad. For a moment, Bull looked like he might physically attack the warden. Then, with visible effort, he controlled himself. Tate has you fooled too, I see. When this place erupts, don't say I didn't warn you. After Bull stormed out, Pritchard collapsed into his chair. He's become a liability. He's been a liability for years, Morales replied. We just looked the other way because he kept things quiet. Pritchard studied her with new awareness. You're distancing yourself from him. Smart move. Just recognizing reality, sir. Morales' face revealed nothing of her thoughts. Bull's methods belong to another era. If Ironclad is going to survive, we need to adapt. And if Bull won't adapt? Her answer was cold, pragmatic. Then he becomes a sacrifice for the greater good. Lieutenant Wilkes stood in the prison yard, watching inmates exercise during their restricted recreation period. The racial divide was stark. White inmates using the basketball court and weight area, black inmates confined to a small corner under heavy guard. The tension was so thick Wilkes could almost taste it, like ozone before a lightning strike. How? Long before something sparked the inevitable explosion? And what would remain of Ironclad and himself when it was over? His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text message from his wife. Did you see the news? Another prison scandal in Alabama. Officers arrested for civil rights violations. The parallels to Ironclad were unmistakable. The same abuses, the same system protecting itself at all costs, the same eventual collapse when the truth finally emerged. Wilkes made his decision. That night after his shift, he compiled the videos he'd recorded, dozens of clips showing Bull's regime in unflinching detail. Not just the recent lockdown, but months of systematic abuses, the beatings, the racial targeting, the corruption that infected every level of Ironclad's operation. He saved everything to a secure cloud drive, then composed an email to the journalist whose card he'd kept, attaching a link to the evidence. His finger hovered over the send button, 20 years of career loyalty battling against his awakened conscience. Before he could decide, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Captain Morales. He answered warily. Lieutenant, are you still at the facility? Just leaving, Captain. Return to the administration wing immediately. Bull's called an emergency response team. Claims there's intelligence about a coordinated uprising. Wilkes's blood ran cold. What intelligence? Nothing verified, Morales replied, and Wilkes could hear the tension in her voice. But he's convinced Pritchard it's credible. They're mobilizing tactical teams, riot gear, the works. Captain, this sounds like a pretext, she finished for him. I know. That's why I need you here, as a witness, if nothing else. After hanging up, Wilkes stared at his unsent email. If Bull was manufacturing a crisis to reassert control, things were about to get much worse. The evidence might become irrelevant if Ironclad descended into the violence Bull seemed determined to provoke. With a decisive tap, Wilkes pressed send. Whatever happened next, the truth would survive. In his cell in solitary, Malcolm sensed the change before he heard it, a shift in the air, a different quality to the silence that preceded the storm. Then the heavy tread of boots in the corridor, the rattle of keys, the door swinging open to reveal Bull Hardwick in full riot gear, a squad of similarly equipped officers behind him. "Your time's up, Tate," Bull said, his voice muffled by his face shield but the satisfaction unmistakable. "Your little revolution ends tonight." "What's happening?" Malcolm asked, though he already knew the answer. Bull's smile was visible even through the shield. "Riot response. Your followers got a little too enthusiastic. Unfortunate, but it gives us the opportunity to restore proper order." "There is no riot," Malcolm said calmly. "Not yet," Bull agreed. "But there will be. And you're going to be right in the middle of it." As they led him from solitary toward the general population blocks, Malcolm understood Bull's desperate gambit. Unable to break the resistance through conventional means, Bull was escalating to provoke the violence he knew how to control. By placing Malcolm directly into a volatile situation while tactical teams stood ready to restore order, Bull would create the crisis he needed to eliminate the threat once and for all. It was a dangerous, potentially deadly strategy, and Malcolm had only moments to counter it before Ironclad erupted into exactly the chaos Bull was counting on. Malcolm walked between two guards toward the general population blocks, his mind racing to formulate a response to Bull's manufactured crisis. The corridor echoed with radio chatter and the distant sound of raised voices, the chaos already beginning. "You're making a mistake, Sergeant," Malcolm said quietly. Bull turned, his face shield reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. "The only mistake was not putting you down the first day you arrived." He nodded to the guards. "Take him to the center of B Block. Make sure everyone sees him." As they approached B Block, the noise intensified. Shouting, the metallic bang of something heavy striking cell bars, the unmistakable sounds of conflict. When the doors opened, Malcolm was thrust into calculated pandemonium. Two white inmates were attacking a black prisoner while others formed a circle around them. Guards stood back, watching, some with hands hovering near their weapons, others with the bored expression of men viewing a spectacle they'd seen before. Bull pushed forward, keying his radio. B Block disturbance confirmed, initiating containment. Protocol. His voice carried official urgency, but Malcolm caught the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Across the block, Lieutenant Wilkes arrived with his own team, assessing the situation with growing alarm. "What the hell is happening here?" he demanded, moving to break up the fight. "Stand down, Lieutenant," Bull ordered. "This is now a tactical operation." Wilkes ignored him, pushing through to separate the combatants. "Everyone back to your cells, now." Bull yanked him back. "I gave you an order." "Your order is going to get people killed," Wilkes shot back, loud enough for inmates to hear. "This isn't a tactical situation. It's a staged provocation." The accusation hung in the air, momentarily freezing the chaotic scene. Inmates and guards alike turned toward the confrontation between the two officers. Bull's face darkened with rage. "You're relieved of duty, Lieutenant. Surrender your weapons and remove yourself from the facility." "No." Wilkes stood his ground. "I'm not leaving these people to whatever you've got planned." The standoff between Bull and Wilkes created a crucial moment of suspended action. The orchestrated violence paused as everyone watched this unprecedented challenge to Bull's authority. Malcolm seized the opportunity. "This is what he wants," he called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "Violence that justifies more violence, a reason to use lethal force." Eyes turned to him, some hostile, others questioning, many calculating their own survival in the unfolding drama. "Look around you," Malcolm continued. "White inmates provoked into fighting black inmates, guards watching instead of intervening. Ask yourselves who benefits from us tearing each other apart." "Shut him up," Bull ordered, but the nearest guards hesitated, uncertain which authority to follow as Wilkes countermanded him. "Let him speak," Wilkes said. "Everyone stay calm." Malcolm stood straighter, addressing the entire block. "For 20 years, Bull Hardwick has ruled this prison by keeping us divided. White against black, gang against gang, guard against inmate. And what has it gotten any of us? More suffering, longer sentences, lives destroyed." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Bull, seeing his control slipping, made a desperate gambit. "This is an official lockdown," he shouted. "All inmates, return to cells immediately. Anyone still out in 30 seconds will face lethal response." He drew his pistol, a shocking escalation that violated a dozen protocols. Several inmates backed away, but others stood firm, sensing the desperation behind his threat. "Put the weapon down, Sergeant," Wilkes ordered, his own hand moving to his holster. "You going to shoot me, Lieutenant?" Bull sneered, his gun still raised. "For these animals? I'll shoot anyone who threatens lives unnecessarily," Wilkes replied, his voice steady. "Including you." In that moment of deadly standoff, Red Carter emerged from the crowd, positioning himself beside Malcolm. "Nobody's dying today," he announced. "Not for his games." Bull's gaze darted between Malcolm, Wilkes, and Red, realizing his plan was unraveling. With a sudden movement, he fired a shot into the ceiling, the sound exploding through the block like a thunderclap. "Riot in progress," he shouted into his radio. "Officer under attack. Full tactical response authorized." The gunshot shattered the fragile calm. Some inmates scattered, others surged forward in panic or anger. Guards drew weapons, uncertain who they were supposed to be targeting. In the confusion, Malcolm moved with purpose, grabbing Red's arm. "We need to control this before people get killed." Red nodded, immediately understanding. He whistled sharply, a signal that brought his lieutenants and their allies rushing toward them. "What's the play?" he asked Malcolm. "Organized disruption, not destruction," Malcolm replied. "Take control of key areas. No attacks on personnel. No one gets hurt if we can help it." "And if Bull's men come in shooting?" Malcolm's eyes hardened. "Then we make sure the world knows who started this war." While Bull was shouting contradictory orders into his radio, Malcolm's coalition moved with surprising discipline. Groups of inmates secured the block's entrance points. Others formed human barriers between the most aggressive inmates and potential targets. Red's network spread the strategy to other blocks, transforming what Bull had intended as chaotic violence into something more controlled, more like a coordinated protest than a riot. Wilkes watched this unfold with astonishment. Instead of attacking guards or destroying property, the inmates were containing the violence Bull had tried to instigate. "What are they doing?" another guard asked him, bewildered. "They're showing us who the real threat is," Wilkes replied. In the administrative wing, Captain Morales and Warden Pritchard watched the security feeds with growing alarm. What they saw contradicted Bull's frantic radio reports of a full-scale riot. While there was unrest, it was nothing like the bloody uprising he described. "He's lying," Morales said flatly. "Look at Monitor 4. Inmates are holding others back from the guards, not attacking them." Pritchard's politician's instincts for self-preservation kicked into high gear. "Bull's created this situation, and now he wants authorization for lethal force?" He shook his head. "I'm not signing off on a massacre based on false pretenses." "If we don't back him," Morales pointed out, "we're choosing sides." Pritchard's gaze was cold. "I'm choosing the side that keeps me out of prison, Captain. Bull's gone too far." He picked up the phone, bypassing Bull entirely to contact state authorities. "This is Warden Pritchard at Ironclad. We have a situation requiring National Guard assistance, but I need to be clear. This is for peacekeeping only. We have evidence that suggests internal escalation by prison staff." When he hung up, Morales studied him with new respect. "You've just ended your alliance with Bull." "Bull ended it himself," Pritchard replied, "when he put his vendetta above institutional survival." In B Block, the situation had reached a stalemate. Inmates controlled the common areas but had made no move to break out or take hostages. Guards maintained positions at entry points but didn't advance, awaiting clear orders from a fragmented chain of command. Bull stalked the perimeter, fury radiating from him like heat. His tactical team stood ready for his command, but the riot he'd expected, the excuse for overwhelming force, hadn't materialized. "This ends now," he growled, turning to his most loyal officers. "Gas the whole block. When they're disoriented, we go in hard." "Sir," one officer protested, "there are guards still inside and the inmates aren't." "That's an order," Bull shouted. "They want to follow Tate instead of respecting the natural order. Let them choke on that decision." Before the officers could act on this command, Lieutenant Wilkes emerged from B Block, approaching with determined strides. Behind him, Malcolm Tate and Red Carter walked side by side, hands raised to signal nonviolence. "What the hell is this?" Bully demanded. "A negotiation," Wilkes answered. "They're willing to end this peacefully." Bull laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "Negotiate with inmates? Have you lost your mind?" "Look around you, Sergeant," Wilkes said quietly. "Your riot didn't happen. Your excuse for slaughter didn't materialize. It's over." Bull's hand moved toward his weapon. "It's not over until I say it is." "It's over, Bull," came Captain Morales's voice as she approached with Warden Pritchard and several officers. "Stand down." Bull turned to them, his expression vacillating between rage and disbelief. "You're taking their side? Against me, after everything I've done to keep this place under control?" "What you've done," Pritchard said coldly, "is fabricate a crisis to pursue a personal vendetta, endangering everyone in this facility." "You authorized the lockdown," Bull shot back. "You approved every measure I took." "I authorized security." "Protocols," Pritchard replied. "Not racial targeting, not provoking violence, and certainly not lying to justify lethal force." Bull's gaze darted between them, finally settling on Morales. "Helen, 20 years we've worked together. You know what it takes to control animals like these." Morales's expression remained impassive. "The National Guard will be here within the hour. Legitimate authorities who follow the rule of law." She stepped closer. "It's finished, Bull. The only question is whether you end this with dignity or in restraints." For a moment, the old Bull surfaced, calculating, pragmatic, recognizing when to retreat and regroup. Then his eyes found Malcolm standing calmly beside Wilkes, and something in him snapped. With startling speed, he drew his weapon and aimed directly at Malcolm. "You did this," he snarled. "Turned my prison against me. Poisoned minds with your talk of equality and justice." His finger tightened on the trigger. "There's only one justice that matters." "Bull, don't!" Morales shouted. The shot never came. Officer Simpson, positioned behind Bull, brought his baton down on Bull's wrist with a sickening crack. The gun clattered to the floor as Bull howled in pain and rage. "Officer Simpson," Morales said, her voice returning to professional calm, "take Sergeant Hardwick into custody. Assault with a deadly weapon, threatening an inmate, inciting a riot, for starters." As Simpson and another guard secured Bull's hands behind his back, the fallen sergeant stared at Malcolm with undiluted hatred. "This isn't over, Tate. Men like me always win in the end." Malcolm met his gaze steadily. "Not anymore. The world's changing, Sergeant. Even in here." Bull continued to struggle as they led him away, his shouted threats echoing down the corridor, diminishing with distance, until they faded entirely, the last roar of a predator whose territory had slipped from his grasp. In the aftermath, Ironclad balanced on a knife's edge. The National Guard established positions throughout the facility, their presence a reminder that control had been temporarily ceded to outside forces. Inmates returned to cells, the protest ending as suddenly as it had begun, but a new awareness hummed through the blocks, the realization that unity had accomplished what violence never could. In the warden's office, Pritchard faced Malcolm, Wilkes, and Morales across his desk, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and calculation. "Let me be clear," he said. "What happened today was inexcusable. Bull went too far, and he'll face consequences." He leaned forward. "But if anyone thinks this means Ironclad is suddenly going to become some kind of progressive experiment in inmate self-governance, they're sorely mistaken." "No one's suggesting that, Warden," Malcolm replied. But there are legitimate grievances that need addressing: racial discrimination, excessive force, corruption that goes beyond one rogue officer. Pritchard's mouth tightened. That sounds dangerously close to threatening exposure, Tate. Not a threat, Malcolm corrected. An opportunity to reform from within before reform is forced from without. Wilkes cleared his throat. Sir, I should inform you that significant evidence of civil rights violations has already been shared with outside authorities. What? Pritchard's face paled. You leaked. I documented systematic abuses, Wilkes interrupted, as was my duty under federal whistleblower protections. He met Pritchard's gaze unflinchingly. The choice now is whether Ironclad leads on reform or becomes a cautionary tale. Pritchard looked to Morales, who offered no sympathy. He's right, she said. Bull was the most visible problem, but not the only one. We have a chance to get ahead of this. The warden sat back, the political animal in him already calculating how to position himself as a reformer rather than an enabler. What exactly are you proposing, Tate? An oversight committee, Malcolm answered, including both staff and inmate representatives, regular reviews of use of force incidents, anti-discrimination training for guards, equal application of rules regardless of race, basic human dignity, Red added, speaking for the first time since entering the office. Nothing revolutionary about that. Pritchard stared at them, particularly at Red's presence in this negotiation, a testament to how dramatically power had shifted in a single day. I'll need time to consider this. Of course, Malcolm said. But understand that the eyes of the world are about to turn toward Ironclad. What they see will determine a lot of futures, yours included. As they left the warden's office, Malcolm and Red walked side by side through corridors now patrolled by National Guard troops. Behind them, Wilkes and Morales followed at a discreet distance. You think Pritchard will actually change anything? Red asked skeptically. No, Malcolm replied. But he'll make a show of it to save himself. And in that space between appearance and reality, real change can take root. Red glanced at him. You planned all this from the beginning, didn't you? From that first beating in D Block. Malcolm shook his head. Not planned. Hoped. Believed it was possible. He paused. What I didn't expect was allies like you. Or Wilkes. Don't get sentimental, Red warned, but his scarred face softened slightly. I'm still looking out for my interests. Just realize they align with something bigger. As they reached B Block, inmates gathered at cell doors, watching their return with new eyes, not just as fellow prisoners, but as leaders who had accomplished what violence never could, forcing the system to acknowledge their humanity. In his office converted from a storage room, Bull Hardwick sat alone, stripped of his badge and gun, awaiting transfer to the county jail. 23 years of absolute rule ended in a single day. Through his window he could see the yard where he had once walked like a king. Now National Guard soldiers patrolled in his place. How had it come to this? How had one man, a black convict with nothing but words and ideas, managed to dismantle the empire Bull had built through fear and force? The answer eluded him, his mind still trapped in the certainties that had guided his life. That power came from dominance, that racial hierarchy was the natural order, that men like him always prevailed in the end. Bull didn't understand that the world had changed, that his methods belonged to a dying era. And in that failure of understanding lay the true reason for his fall. Outside his window, in the yard now illuminated by floodlights, Bull watched Malcolm walk with Wilkes, their conversation intense but respectful. Around them, the prison continued, its cautious return to routine, but nothing would be the same again. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and Bull Hardwick, once the unchallenged ruler of Ironclad, was now just another man awaiting judgment. The morning after the failed riot, Bull Hardwick sat in a holding cell in the county jail, the orange jumpsuit hanging loosely on his frame. His hands, unaccustomed to being restrained, kept rising to touch the empty space where his badge had been for 23 years. Each time the handcuffs clinked, a metallic reminder of his fallen status. Through the small window in his cell door, he watched guards pass. Men he'd trained with, drank with, shared secrets with. None would meet his gaze. The brotherhood that had once circled protectively around him had dissolved overnight, its members scrambling to distance themselves from his disgrace. Sheriff Denton, a man who had deferred to Bull for decades, entered the cell block with deliberate steps, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Hardwick," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Your arraignment's scheduled for 11. Multiple charges, civil rights violations, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, abuse of power. Bail hearing will follow." Bull raised his eyes. "Who's handling my defense?" The union attorney withdrew. Denton replied, unable to hide his discomfort. "Conflict of interest," he said. "Conflict of interest," Bull repeated bitterly. 20 years paying dues and now I'm a conflict? Denton shifted his weight. "It's complicated, Bull. The state's launching a full investigation into Ironclad. Feds might get involved too. Nobody wants to be caught on the wrong side of this." "And which side is that, Jim? The side of law and order? The side we've both served our whole careers? The side that isn't going to prison?" Denton answered bluntly. "Your footage is all over the news, Bull. Lieutenant Wilkes captured everything, the racial targeting, the fabricated riot, you pulling a gun on an unarmed inmate." Bull's face darkened. "Wilkes should have known that sanctimonious bastard would betray me." "He's not the only one," Denton said, lowering his voice. "Morales has already given a statement distancing the administration from your unauthorized actions. Pritchard's holding a press conference this afternoon about zero tolerance for abuse of power." The news hit Bull like physical blows. Helen Morales, who had approved his methods for years. Pritchard, who had looked the other way as long as Bull kept the prison quiet and profitable. Now they were positioning themselves as reformers while he took the fall alone. "They knew," Bull growled. "Everything I did they sanctioned. They benefited." "Maybe so," Denton acknowledged. "But they didn't get caught on camera pulling a gun. They didn't create a paper trail. And they've got inmates willing to testify against you, but not them." Bull's laugh was hollow. "Let me guess. Malcolm Tate leading the charge?" "Among others. Carter's people too. Even some of the white inmates you thought were loyal." Denton checked his watch. "Transport will be here in 30 minutes to take you to court. Might want to prepare yourself. There's media camped outside." After Denton left, Bull sat in silence, the reality of his situation sinking deeper. He wasn't just facing criminal charges. He was facing them alone, abandoned by the very system he'd served with such brutal efficiency. At Ironclad, the mood was one of cautious transformation. National Guard troops still patrolled the corridors, but their presence felt less like occupation and more like neutral observation. Inmates moved with a new awareness, not freedom exactly, but the absence of arbitrary terror. In the administration wing, Wilkes sat across from Captain Morales, both flanking a state investigator who had arrived that morning. "Let's be clear, Lieutenant," the investigator said, reviewing notes. "Your testimony implicates not just Sergeant Hardwick, but potentially Captain Morales and Warden Pritchard in a pattern of civil rights violations stretching back years." "That's correct," Wilkes replied, refusing to flinch from Morales's steady gaze. "Yet both the captain and warden are cooperating with our investigation, claiming they were unaware of the extent of Hardwick's abuses." Wilkes smiled thinly. "Convenient." The investigator leaned forward. "Lieutenant, I understand your desire for comprehensive accountability, but proving knowledge and intent at the administrative level is difficult without documentation, which they were careful not to create," Wilkes said. "Precisely." The investigator closed his notebook. "The district attorney is prepared to offer you full immunity in exchange for focusing your testimony on Hardwick. Your whistleblower status would be preserved, your pension secured." Wilkes felt the weight of 20 years pressing on him. The mortgage payments, his children's college tuition, the future he'd planned. All of it secured by simply allowing Morales and Pritchard to escape the consequences of their complicity. "And if I insist on telling the whole truth?" he asked. "Then it becomes messier," the investigator admitted. Your immunity might be more limited. The prison administration would likely contest your characterization of events, making it your word against theirs. Morales spoke for the first time. Daniel, she said, using Wilkes's first name with unusual intimacy, what matters now is reforming. Ironclad. Bull was the enforcer, the one who crossed lines no one else would. With him gone, real change is possible. Under your leadership? Wilkes asked skeptically. Under oversight, she corrected. The governor's appointing an independent review board, new training protocols, body cameras, regular audits. She held his gaze. The system can change without burning it to the ground. Wilkes felt the moral compromise being offered, partial justice in exchange for workable reform. Bull as the sacrificial lamb while the architects of the system reinvented themselves as its saviors. Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. An officer entered, looking uncomfortable. Ma'am, Malcolm Tate is requesting to speak with Lieutenant Wilkes. Says it's important. Morales frowned. This isn't a good time. Actually, the investigator interjected, I'd like to hear what he has to say. Tate's testimony will be central to our case. Moments later, Malcolm entered, nodding respectfully to each person in the room. Since the failed riot, he'd moved, with a new authority. Not arrogance, but the confidence of a man who had forced the world to see what he saw. Lieutenant, Malcolm said, addressing Wilkes directly. I thought you should know that several inmates have been approached with offers of reduced sentences in exchange for testimony focusing exclusively on Bull. Testimony that specifically excludes Captain Morales and Warden Pritchard. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Wilkes looked to Morales, whose expression remained carefully neutral. That would be outside my knowledge, she said smoothly. The district attorney's office handles all plea negotiations. Of course, Malcolm replied, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. Just like Bull's methods were outside your knowledge despite 20 years of working alongside him. The investigator studied Malcolm with new interest. Mr. Tate, are you suggesting that inmates are being pressured to present an incomplete picture? I'm stating it as fact, Malcolm answered, just as I'm stating that meaningful reform can't happen if we pretend Bull Hardwick was a rogue actor, rather than the product of a system that rewarded his methods as long as they remained hidden. Wilkes felt something settle in his chest. Clarity he'd been searching for. I agree, he said, turning to the investigator. I appreciate the offer of immunity, but I'll be testifying to everything I witnessed, including administrative knowledge and approval of Bull's tactics. Morales' eyes flashed with anger before she controlled her expression. You're making a mistake, Lieutenant. Without immunity, you could face charges yourself. Maybe, Wilkes acknowledged. But I could face myself even less if I took the easy way out now. The investigator sighed, closing his notebook. I'll inform the DA of your decision. Both of your decisions, he added, nodding to Malcolm. Though I should warn you, cases like this often end with messy compromises rather than clean justice. After the investigator left, Morales remained, her calculated facade slipping to reveal genuine frustration. You realize what you're doing? Without a targeted case against Bull, the whole thing could fall apart. He could walk free. Or, Malcolm countered, those who enabled him could finally face consequences alongside him. Morales stood, straightening, her uniform with precise movements. I've survived 20 years in a system designed to crush women like me. I did what was necessary to advance, to gain the power to make changes from within. Her voice hardened. I won't apologize for that, and I won't be sacrificed for it either. After she left, Wilkes turned to Malcolm. She'll fight back hard. Pritchard too. I'm counting on it, Malcolm replied. The more they fight, the more they reveal. Wilkes studied him curiously. You know, in all this time I've never asked why you're doing this. You could have kept your head down, served your time quietly. Why risk everything? Malcolm was silent for a moment. When I was first arrested, the officer who processed me said something I'll never forget. He said, the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. He meant it to crush my spirit, but it did the opposite. He met Wilkes's gaze. Systems can be redesigned, but only if we stop pretending they're accidents rather than choices. In the county courthouse, Bull Hardwick stood before Judge Eliza Watkins, a black woman in her 60s whose reputation for courtroom rigor had intimidated attorneys for decades. "Bail is denied," she announced, gavel striking with finality. "The defendant poses both a flight risk and a danger to witnesses, many of whom remain under his former supervision at Ironclad Correctional Facility." Bull's hastily appointed public defender began to protest, but Judge Watkins cut him off. Furthermore, given the nature of the charges and the defendant's former position, he will be held in protective custody at State Correctional Facility rather than returning to county jail. Next case. As court officers moved to escort him out, Bull caught sight of Warden Pritchard sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching proceedings with clinical detachment. When their eyes met, Pritchard gave a small, almost imperceptible, nod acknowledgement without sympathy. The message was clear. Bull was on his own. The processing into state correctional was a surreal inversion of Bull's professional life. The same procedures he had overseen thousands of times were now applied to him. The stripping, the cavity search, the delousing shower, the issuance of prison clothing. Each step designed to strip away individuality and dignity, to transform a person into an inmate. "Hardwick, Frank," droned the intake officer, a man about Bull's age who avoided eye contact as he recorded information. "Prisoner 78291, housing assignment, protective custody, East Wing." "East Wing?" Bull questioned. "That's for informants and child molesters." The officer finally looked up, his expression void of empathy. "That's for inmates who wouldn't survive general population, like former corrections officers." As he was led to his cell, Bull walked the gauntlet of hostile stares from both inmates and officers. The inmates' hatred was expected, but the officers' cold assessment struck deeper. They saw in him a cautionary tale, a reminder that the shield separating them from those they guarded was thinner than they pretended. His cell was 6 by 9 feet, standard protective custody dimensions. The door clanged shut behind him with the same finality he had imposed on countless others. For the first time in decades, Bull Hardwick was powerless, caged, subject to another's authority. He sat on the thin mattress, hands trembling slightly as they had since his arrest. 23 years of imposing his will on Ironclad, and now, he couldn't even control when the lights turned on or off. "How's it feel, Bull?" came a voice from the neighboring cell. Being on the other side, Bull recognized the speaker. Martinez, a former gang leader he'd personally sent to solitary a dozen times for attitude adjustment. "Enjoying yourself, Martinez?" Bull replied, trying to summon his old authority. "Everyone is," Martinez answered, his laugh low and satisfied. "Word travels fast in the system. By now, every prison in the state knows the great Bull Hardwick is wearing the same clothes as the men he tortured." Bull said nothing, knowing any response would only feed Martinez's satisfaction. "You should thank whatever God you believe in, that you're in protective custody," Martinez continued. "If they put you in general population..." He let the threat hang unfinished. That night, as lights dimmed across the facility, Bull lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories of his career playing like a film he was seeing from a new angle. The beatings he'd ordered, the racial humiliations he'd orchestrated, the lives he'd casually destroyed in service to his vision of natural order. For the first time, he felt the faintest whisper of something unfamiliar. Not remorse exactly, but a dawning awareness that what he had built at Ironclad had ultimately consumed him too. At Ironclad, change came in increments. National Guard. Troops withdrew after a week, replaced by state monitors who observed but rarely intervened. Warden Pritchard, fighting for his professional survival, implemented a series of highly visible reforms: body cameras for all officers, an inmate grievance system with outside review, mandatory anti-discrimination training. Red Carter, now the acknowledged leader of the inmate population, worked with Malcolm to ensure these weren't merely cosmetic changes. Their influence had grown beyond symbolic resistance to practical governance, negotiating better conditions, mediating conflicts, maintaining the fragile peace that had emerged from chaos. In the prison library, Malcolm and Red met with a small group of inmate representatives, a council that would have been unthinkable under Bull's regime. Food quality's improving, reported Santos, representing Latino inmates, and the new educational programs are actually decent. Medical care's still inadequate, countered Jackson, an older black inmate. 3-week wait to see a doctor, even with serious conditions. Malcolm nodded, making notes. We'll raise that in tomorrow's meeting with the administration, along with the visitation concerns. Red observed the discussion with measured satisfaction. You know none of this fixes the bigger problem, right? Most of us shouldn't even be in here. 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums, racist policing, that doesn't change because our cells are cleaner. No, Malcolm agreed, but it's a start. Change has to begin somewhere. After the meeting dispersed, Malcolm found Wilkes waiting in the corridor. The lieutenant had weathered the investigation with his integrity intact, though his testimony against Morales and Pritchard had earned him isolation among the remaining officers. Thought you should know, Wilkes said without preamble. Bull's case is headed for a plea deal. 5 years instead of 20, with the possibility of parole after 3. Malcolm absorbed this with calm resignation. The system protecting its own? Not surprising. Not completely, Wilkes countered. His career's over, his reputation destroyed, and he'll serve those years as what he fears most, an inmate, not an officer. Justice comes in many forms, Malcolm acknowledged. Sometimes incomplete but still meaningful. Wilkes hesitated before adding, there's something else. Morales is resigning. The investigation didn't have enough to charge her, but the political pressure became too great. And Pritchard? Surviving for now, recasting himself as a reformer. Wilkes smiled grimly. Though his days are numbered too, the governor's appointed an independent warden to take over next month. Malcolm nodded, recognizing the pattern. Systems bending rather than breaking, sacrificing pieces to preserve the whole. It wasn't complete victory, but neither was it defeat. What about you? He asked. After everything you've risked? Wilkes looked away, his future uncertain. I testified before the State Oversight Committee yesterday, laid out everything, the abuses, the cover-ups, my own complicity through silence. He met Malcolm's gaze again. It felt like confession and absolution. That's not for me to decide, Wilkes replied. I just know I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent any longer. As he walked away, Malcolm reflected on the complex morality of their struggle. Bull would face consequences, but not equal to his crimes. Morales would lose her position, but escape legal punishment. Pritchard might eventually fall, but softly, with golden parachutes and consulting opportunities. The system would survive, adapting just enough to relieve pressure while preserving its essential character. But something had changed nonetheless. The inmates of Ironclad had discovered their collective power. The veil of invincibility surrounding figures like Bull had been torn away. The silent complicity that enabled abuse had been given voice through Wilkes's testimony. It wasn't revolution, but evolution. Painful, incomplete, yet undeniably real. That evening, as Malcolm sat in his cell writing in the journal he'd kept since his first day at Ironclad, a guard appeared at his door. Tate, visitor. In the visitation room, Malcolm found himself face to face with Esther Johnson, the elderly community activist who had mentored him before his arrest. Seeing her brought a rush of emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. Mrs. Johnson, he said, his voice thick, you came all this way. Had to see for myself, she replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The young man who did what none of us could, made them see the truth from inside these walls. Not just me, Malcolm demurred. Many people risked everything. But you struck the first match, she insisted, and look at the fire it started. She pushed a newspaper across the table. The headline read, Ironclad Scandal Prompts Statewide Prison Reform Bill. Below it was a smaller headline. Former Sergeant Hardwick begins sentence as investigation widens. Malcolm scanned the article, which detailed how the revelations at Ironclad had prompted investigations at 3 other state facilities, with similar patterns of abuse emerging. "Your fight isn't over," Mrs. Johnson said, "but you've opened doors that were sealed shut for generations." Malcolm touched the paper, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished and what remained to be done. "Bull thought it was about him and me," he said quietly. "A personal battle. He never understood it was about something much larger." "Men like that rarely do," Mrs. Johnson replied. "They believe in power, not justice. In walls, not bridges." As visiting hours ended, Malcolm returned to his cell, the newspaper tucked under his arm. Through his window, he could see the yard where months earlier he had first faced Bull's orchestrated violence. It looked the same, concrete and chain link under harsh lights, yet everything had changed. Tomorrow, Bull Hardwick would wake in a cell much like Malcolm's, experiencing the powerlessness he had inflicted on others for decades. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a reckoning nonetheless, one that rippled beyond a single man to touch, the system that had created him. Malcolm closed his eyes, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, but something quieter and more profound, the knowledge that moral arcs could be bent toward justice, even in places designed to deny it existed. 6 months after the failed riot at Ironclad, Bull Hardwick stood at the transport dock of State Correctional, shackled and waiting. The protective custody that had sheltered him was ending. Budget cuts, they claimed, though Bull knew better. Someone wanted him to face what he had created. "Prisoner 78291, step forward," ordered the transfer officer, a young man who looked at Bull with the same clinical detachment Bull had once used on new inmates. "Final destination, Ironclad Correctional, general population." Bull's stomach clenched. "There must be some mistake. I can't go back there." "No mistake," the officer replied, checking his clipboard. "Transfer approved by the Department of Corrections. Special circumstances waiver signed by Warden Davis." Davis? The name was unfamiliar to Bull. Ironclad's new warden, specialized in institutional reform. The officer smiled thinly. "Seems he thinks your rehabilitation would benefit from facing your former colleagues." As the transport van pulled away, Bull stared through the mesh-covered window at the prison that had been his home for 6 months. State Correctional had been harsh, humiliating, but at least he'd been protected from the general population. At Ironclad, where every inmate knew his name and history, where many carried scars he had personally inflicted. Bull closed his eyes, trying to control his breathing. He was Frank Hardwick, 23 years as a corrections officer, feared and respected. He had survived worse than this. But as the van approached the familiar silhouette of Ironclad rising from the Georgia pines, Bull knew he was lying to himself. He had never faced anything like this, returning as prisoner to the kingdom he once ruled. The irony wasn't lost on him. How many times had he told defiant inmates, "This is my house"? Now the house remained, but he was just another unwelcome guest. Processing into Ironclad was a special kind of hell. Officers who had once snapped to attention at his approach now processed his paperwork with deliberate slowness, their eyes revealing a mixture of contempt, curiosity, and uncomfortable self-reflection. "Arms up," ordered Officer Simpson, whom Bull had once trusted with his dirtiest work. "Standard search procedure." Bull complied, bile rising in his throat as Simpson's gloved hands moved over him with mechanical thoroughness. The same procedure Bull had used thousands of times to establish dominance now worked in reverse, reinforcing his powerlessness. "Still got that bad shoulder, Simpson?" Bull asked, grasping for any semblance of their former relationship. Simpson's face remained impassive. "Quiet during search, inmate." The use of inmate rather than his name or number was deliberate, a message that Simpson recognized him but chose to deny their history. A survival strategy, Bull realized. Distance yourself from the fallen to avoid sharing their fate. After processing, Bull was led through familiar corridors that now seemed alien from this new perspective. Inmates stopped to stare, whispering as he passed. Some smirked. Others made small, threatening gestures out of the officer's sight. The message was clear: your day is coming. To Bull's surprise, he was assigned to C Block, not the harsher D Block where he had sent Malcolm, but a mid-security section housing mostly non-violent offenders. A small mercy, though he suspected it was calculated. Keep him alive but vulnerable. An object lesson rather than a martyr. His cellmate was an older white man named Garrison, serving 10 years for embezzlement. When Bull entered, Garrison looked up from his book with studied neutrality. "Heard you were coming," Garrison said simply. "Top bunk's yours." Bull set his meager possessions on the assigned bunk. "You know who I am?" "Everyone knows," Garrison replied, returning to his book. "The famous Bull Hardwick, architect of the old Ironclad. And that doesn't bother you?" Bull asked, genuinely curious. "Sharing space with a former guard?" Garrison turned a page. "I try not to concern myself with other men's pasts, especially in here." He looked up, his gaze direct but not hostile. "But fair warning, not everyone shares my philosophy. Watch yourself in the yard." The yard. Bull had spent thousands of hours overseeing that open space, watching for tensions, approving which inmates could gather where. Now he would enter it as just another body to be counted and contained. When yard time arrived the following day, Bull hesitated at the threshold. Taking that step would make his new reality undeniable, fully exposing him to the population he had terrorized for decades. "Move along, Hardwick," the supervising officer said, not unkindly. "Delaying only makes it worse." Bull stepped into the sunlight, immediately scanning for threats as his training dictated. The yard had changed, no longer strictly segregated. By race, though natural groupings remained. Near the weight pile, he spotted Red Carter holding court with his lieutenants. By the basketball courts, Latino inmates who had once kept to themselves now mingled more freely with others. And there, sitting at a table with a small group of men from various blocks, was Malcolm Tate. He was reading something to them from a worn book, his voice too distant to make out, but his manner calm and focused. Bull found an unoccupied corner and positioned himself with his back to the fence, trying to become invisible, an impossible task for a man of his size and notoriety. It took less than 10 minutes for the first challenge to arrive. 3 white inmates approached, led by Wagner, the Beau, same man Bull had once sent to test Malcolm. The irony wasn't lost on Bull. "Well, look who it is," Wagner said, loud enough for nearby inmates to hear. The mighty Bull hiding in the corner like a scared puppy. Bull straightened, instinctively reaching for authority he no longer possessed. "Back off, Wagner. I'm not looking for trouble." Wagner laughed. "That's new. You used to manufacture trouble, assigned men to cells where you knew they'd be attacked, ordered beatings in the middle of the night." He stepped closer. "Remember Thomas Johnson? Black kid, 19 years old, first offense? Died of unknown causes after a night in isolation?" Bull's face remained impassive, but his mind flashed to the young inmate who had talked back once too often. The lesson that went too far. The paperwork quietly fixed. "Nothing to say?" Wagner pressed. "No threats? No reminders about the natural order?" "What do you want, Wagner?" Bull asked tiredly. "Just introducing myself," Wagner replied with a cruel smile. "Making sure you understand things have changed while you were gone. The old rules don't apply anymore." He lowered his voice. "But new ones do, and you'll learn them soon enough." As Wagner and his companions moved away, Bull noticed that other inmates had been watching the interaction closely, testing the waters, gauging whether Bull was still dangerous or merely wounded prey. More concerning was the officer's response, or lack thereof. They had observed without intervening, their faces revealing nothing. No protection there, Bull realized. Not for him. The most surprising development came an hour into yard time, when Red Carter approached Bull's corner alone. The gang leader's scarred face was unreadable as he studied the former sergeant. "Didn't think I'd see you back here," Red said finally. "Figured they'd keep you in protective custody until your sentence was up." Bull met his gaze with effort. Apparently, my rehabilitation requires facing the consequences of my actions. Red laughed, a short, harsh sound. Rehabilitation? That's what they're calling it? He shook his head. No. Somebody wanted you to suffer up close and personal. Question is, who's got that kind of pull with the DOC? The implication was clear. Someone with influence had arranged Bull's transfer. Warden Pritchard, Morales, or someone even higher up the chain who needed Bull to remain a visible cautionary tale. What do you want, Carter? Bull asked directly. Just curious, Red replied. Wanted to see how the mighty have fallen. He studied Bull with calculating eyes. You've got problems coming. Wagner's crew wants payback for years of favoritism that turned to nothing. The Latinos remember how you let their men get beaten for entertainment. And don't get me started on what the brothers think about you. Bull tensed, waiting for the threat. But Red surprised him. Thing is, mass murder isn't good for business. Draws too much heat, disrupts the new programs we've fought for. He leaned closer. So here's the deal. You keep your head down, stay quiet, and acknowledge the new order, publicly, and I make sure you survive. For now. Bull stared at him. Why would you do that? It's not for you, Red said coldly. It's for what we're building here. Stability. Progress. The kind of place where men can serve their time with dignity instead of terror. His eyes hardened. The kind of place you made damn sure couldn't exist. Before Bull could respond, Red straightened. Think about it, but not too long. Some offers expire quickly in here. As Red walked away, Bull noticed Malcolm watching their interaction from his table, his expression thoughtful. When their eyes met across the yard, Malcolm gave a slight nod. Not friendly, but acknowledging. Then he returned to his reading group as if Bull were no more significant than any other inmate. That dismissal stung more than any confrontation could have. The following days established Bull's new reality with brutal clarity. In the shower, someone stole his soap and towel, leaving him to dry off with paper towels. In the mess hall, his food arrived with suspicious stains. Small humiliations designed to erode his dignity one grain at a time. Yet no serious violence touched him, thanks to Red's invisible protection. It came at a price, though. Bull was expected to demonstrate his acceptance of the new hierarchy. When Red's lieutenant spoke, Bull listened respectfully. When they claimed space, he yielded it without question. The former king became the lowest subject. For a man who had defined himself through dominance, this reversal was psychological torture. Each deference chipped away at the identity he had, built over decades, forcing him to confront fundamental questions. Who was Frank Hardwick without power? What remained when the badge and baton were stripped away? On his 7th day back at Ironclad, Bull entered the yard to find the usual patterns disrupted. Inmates stood in clusters, talking excitedly. Many gathered around a television that had been wheeled outside, an unprecedented event. Curious despite himself, Bull edged closer, keeping to the periphery. On screen, a news anchor was reporting from outside the state capitol. Groundbreaking legislation signed today by Governor Harmon. The Correctional Reform Act, sparked by the Ironclad scandal, establishes independent oversight for all state prisons, mandates racial bias training for officers, ends solitary confinement for nonviolent infractions, and expands educational and rehabilitation programs. The camera cut to a press conference where the governor stood flanked by lawmakers and advocates. Among them, Bull recognized Esther Johnson, the community activist whose organization had supported Malcolm. Beside her stood Lieutenant Wilkes, looking uncomfortable in a suit rather than a uniform. This bill won't undo decades of injustice overnight, the governor was saying. But it marks a turning point in how we approach incarceration in our state. No longer will prisons be warehouses of despair, where abuse flourishes in darkness. Bull turned away, unable to watch more. His legacy was being dismantled in real time, his life's work labeled as barbaric, backwards. The thing enlightened society had evolved beyond. Quite a day, came a voice beside him. Malcolm Tate stood there, his posture relaxed but alert. The stance of a man who had learned to navigate prison while never fully surrendering to it. Bull tensed, uncertain whether this was finally the confrontation he had been dreading. "What do you want, Tate?" "Just to talk," Malcolm replied. "Seems appropriate given the occasion." Bull glanced back at the television. "You got your reform bill, congratulations." "It's not my bill," Malcolm corrected. "It belongs to everyone who fought for it, inside and outside these walls." He studied Bull with detached curiosity. "Including you, in your way." "Me?" Bull couldn't hide his disbelief. "You showed everyone what the system was really built on. Fear, division, racial hierarchy. Made it impossible to ignore." Malcolm's smile held no warmth. "Ironic that your worst qualities ended up serving the cause of justice." Bull looked away. "If you came to gloat, get it over with." "I didn't come to gloat," Malcolm said. "I came to offer you a choice." "What choice could you possibly offer me?" Malcolm gestured around the yard. "You've seen how things work now. Red's protection has kept you alive, but it's conditional, based on your willingness to adapt." He leaned closer. "The question is whether that adaptation is just performance or something deeper." Bull's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "Meaning you can continue as you are, alive but despised, protected but powerless. Or you can actually change." Malcolm held his gaze. "Contribute something positive to the place you helped build. Teach, mentor, share your knowledge of the system so others can navigate it better." Bull stared at him, incredulous. "You want me to help the men I spent decades controlling?" "I want you to decide who Frank Hardwick is without the badge and gun," Malcolm replied. "To see if there's anything worthwhile beneath all that hate and fear you've carried." "And if I refuse?" Bull asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you continue as you are, surviving at Red's pleasure, counting days until your release, hoping the world forgets you existed." Malcolm shrugged. "Your choice." As Malcolm turned to leave, Bull found himself asking, "Why offer this at all? After everything I did to you, to others." Malcolm paused. "Because this was never about you, Sergeant. It was about changing a system. And systems change when people change." He looked back. "Even people like you." Bull watched him walk away, joining Red and a group of other inmates gathered around the television. They made space for Malcolm automatically, their respect evident in the gesture. Not fear, but genuine regard. Something Bull had never earned, in all his years of enforced authority. That night in his cell, as lights dimmed across Ironclad, Bull lay awake contemplating Malcolm's words. The idea that he could reinvent himself after 6 decades of being exactly who he was seemed absurd. And yet, what was the alternative? To live out his remaining years as a shell, defined only by what he had lost? "Trouble sleeping?" Garrison asked from the lower bunk. "Just thinking," Bull replied. "Dangerous pastime in here," Garrison said, echoing words Bull himself had once told Wilkes. "Though I suppose it depends on the thoughts." Bull was silent for a long moment. "What would you do if you had to become someone entirely different? If everything you believed turned out to be wrong?" Garrison chuckled softly. "You're asking the right man. I was a CFO with a corner office, 3 houses, and a yacht. Now I'm a 65-year-old convict who sorts books in the prison library." He paused. "Turns out the core of who you are isn't what you own or what power you hold. It's what remains when all that's stripped away." "And what if nothing remains?" Bull asked quietly. "Then you build something new," Garrison replied. "Day by day, choice by choice." The next morning, Bull entered the yard with purpose rather than dread. He spotted Malcolm at his usual table, surrounded by younger inmates engaged in what appeared to be a study group. Bull approached slowly, aware of eyes tracking his movement. When he reached the table, conversation stopped, tension immediate and palpable. "Tate," Bull said, his voice steady. "About what you said yesterday. I'd like to talk more." Malcolm studied him, searching for sincerity beneath the request. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded toward an empty seat. "Join us," he said simply. "We're discussing the history of prison reform movements. Something tells me you might have a unique perspective to add." As Bull sat, feeling the weight of disbelieving stares from inmates and officers alike, he understood that this moment marked a crossing from which there was no return. The old Bull Hardwick, the sergeant, the enforcer, the believer in natural order, would have to die for whatever new version might emerge. It would be the hardest battle of his life, fought not with fists or batons but with the humility to acknowledge his own brokenness, to face the harm he had caused without excuses or deflection, to learn, perhaps for the first time, how to see others as fully human. Whether he could win that battle remained to be seen, but as he listened to Malcolm guide the discussion with patience and insight, Bull recognized that his former adversary had offered him something unexpected, not forgiveness, but opportunity. A chance to be more than the sum of his worst actions. Across the yard, Red Carter observed this unlikely tableau with measured skepticism. When one of his lieutenants questioned the wisdom of allowing Bull into Malcolm's circle, Red shook his head. "Malcolm knows what he's doing," he said. "Sometimes the most powerful lesson isn't destroying your enemy. It's transforming him." As months passed, Ironclad continued its evolution under new leadership and heightened scrutiny. The reforms sparked by Malcolm's resistance spread beyond a single facility to touch the entire state system, creating spaces where rehabilitation became possible, if not yet probable. For Malcolm, victory wasn't measured in Bull's humbling or even in specific policy changes, but in the shift of collective consciousness, the recognition that institutions built on dehumanization could be redesigned with humanity at their core, that systems maintained through fear could be reimagined through justice. The work remained unfinished, the arc of change longer than any single struggle. But in the yard of Ironclad Correctional, where men once divided by deliberate design now gathered across racial lines to learn and organize, the first foundations of a different future were being laid. And in that building, Malcolm found purpose, beyond resistance, the creation of something that might outlast both the oppressors and the oppressed. A model for transformation that began with the most damaged places and the most dismissed people, yet refused to accept either as beyond repair. It wasn't perfect justice, but in a world of broken systems, it was a beginning. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.